Okay, hello chess players. I got a request from one of my viewers to take a look at this variation in the Ruy Lopez. Begins after e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5, a6, bishop a4, knight f6, and then he wanted to take a look at this move, knight c3. So anyways, if you like content like this and want to see more of it, please hit that subscribe button and look at your notification icon. So the first thing I want to touch on is like why knight c3 is so rare in master play, and why masters in general, like at least over the last 200 years, have been trying other stuff, even though of course, knight c3 is a very reasonable move, and it's also maybe very possible that in the future, especially in modern chess, the way opening theory has progressed and the way it's going, maybe knight c3 is something that we're going to have to see more and more often, just because it's getting harder and harder to get anything out of the main lines anymore. Not because they're not as good, but just because they've been worked out maybe a lot deeper. So if you'll notice, like in the Masters database here on Lichess, we don't see knight c3 very often. We only see it played about 1% of the time. Uh, this goes back to kind of the progression of how opening ideas have changed over the last 200 years, and basically how openings have evolved from a positional perspective. One of the mistakes that people make, especially club players, when they're looking at openings is the first thing that you learn when you play chess. Chess is kind of funny. You know, you learn stuff, and then after you learn everything, you learn how to throw all those ideas out and then kind of start from scratch. You know, it's kind of like if you're learning how to bake a cake and then you're like, okay, well, the first thing you need to do to learn how to break a cake is break a dozen eggs, you know. And then they say, okay, well, I've done that. And then they're like, okay, well, throw those out. Why did I do that? Well, you just did that so that you could learn how to break eggs. Okay, but let's go on to the next step. Um, that's kind of how playing chess is like, is you learn a lot of stuff just to learn how to do it, and then you throw it out, and then you learn other stuff. And that's kind of where this move knight c3 comes into play. Knight c3 is one of these moves that we kind of learn as beginners. You know, just develop your pieces, plop your pieces down in the middle of the board. That's got to be right. And then as we get better, we start realizing that some of these deeper concepts are maybe a little bit more important. And this goes all the way back to kind of the history of the game. If you look at the history of the game, and if you just look at the raw history of the way the opening started, of course, the Italian game was like the very first opening. Bishop c4 is basically the oldest opening. And then the Ruy Lopez came after that. But then after the Italian game and the Ruy Lopez came the Evans Gambit, which was getting played like around the 1860s pretty heavily by guys like Paul Morphy and other players of that day. You know, Adolf Anderson, Louis Paulson. You know, everybody was playing the Evans Gambit. And one of the lines that was getting played in the Evans Gambit was bishop c4 and then bishop c5, b4 takes c3, bishop c5, d4 takes castles, d6 takes bishop b6. This was super, super common back then. Now, Morphy's favorite move was to play knight c3, although Morphy did, I think, try all four moves in this position. He tried d5, bishop b2, knight c3, and h3. But by far and away, like the most influential move in terms of how it affected theory even today was this move pawn to h3. This was the positional move that was getting played by a lot of guys, and I think Morphy even tried it once or twice. And it was realized that after pawn to h3, white probably had an advantage just because he had the pawn duo in the middle of the board. And this was when people started understanding the advantage of the pawn duo. It was back in the 1860s when people were playing the Evans Gambit. They started understanding that even though white was down a pawn here, white probably had a slight advantage just because of this pawn duo in the middle. And they started thinking about what are ways that we can get this pawn duo without necessarily having to sacrifice a pawn. Because if we could do that, then black wouldn't have the compensation of course, having an extra pawn. And that brought people back to that older opening, that brought people back to the Ruy Lopez, of course, the opening that predates the Evans. And they said, is there another way that we can play the Ruy Lopez to give us this pawn duo? And that's really when people started discovering that it was possible after bishop b5, a6, bishop a4, knight f6, it was possible instead of knight to c3 to just castle here. And of course, the idea is after bishop e7, we can play rook e1, and then we can play c3, d4, and we can get the pawn duo. And of course, they weren't overly concerned about knight takes e4 because you can just play d4. And as you can see, according to the engine, we have some sort of advantage. But even back then, they understood that they had to have some sort of advantage since, you know, they're breaking up the middle of the board, and black just doesn't have enough development to hold that together. So this became kind of the way that people played it, not just right after, but probably for the next couple hundred years. It even dominates the way that people think about chess today, is going after this idea of playing rook to e1 and c3 and d4. And what's really interesting is even if we're playing this new idea with knight to c3, this idea of getting the pawn duo in the middle of the board still has to be the primary idea. If you want any sort of advantage out of the position down the road, you're gonna have to play for this pawn duo at some point. There's just no other way to get an advantage. So when you play a move like knight c3, basically what you're saying is I'm going to play for this pawn duo, but I'm going to do it very, 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 very slowly. So even though you're developing seemingly very quickly, you're like, oh, I'm making this fast development move, you're actually slowing down your plan pretty significantly, which is why the computer says the position is already equal. Really, there's nothing special here objectively from a perspective of objective chess. But from the perspective of my opponent has maybe worked out castles kingside followed by rook e1, c3, d4. Maybe my opponent has worked out all the theory in these lines all the way to move 40 or 50 or 60. Maybe you have a much better chance of getting something out of knight c3 because maybe they at least haven't looked at these positions to absolute death. So this first game we're taking a look at is Carlsen versus Caruana, which just ended in a draw. But you'll notice some of the ideas that Carlsen employed in this game. He castled, played bishop back. We have a4, just trying to get something. Rook b8 just holds it together. And then eventually you're going to see d3. And what you're going to see Carlsen try is just bringing this knight to e2 and g3, and then eventually playing c3 and d4. Because there's just no other way to get anything out of these Ruy Lopez type positions other than eventually going for that pawn duo in the middle of the board. There's just no other way to try to play for an advantage. So you're still playing the Ruy Lopez ideas, you're just basically delaying them for a bunch of moves. And when Carlsen plays this with white, which he does, because again, Carlsen is the kind of guy, he's going to play out a book a little bit, try to get people out of theory, try to play something that's still at least equal, and then try to play something that's still close to the ideas way down the road, and then try to get an advantage. This is a reasonable way to play chess. Carlsen plays chess like this a lot. But of course, the downside is these positions are dangerously equal, especially in the early opening. So we have h6, h3, and then we have this slow plan, knight g3, c3. And then eventually going for d4, he's going for the pawn duo. But at least against Caruana in this game, he was unable to get anything out of it. Caruana is, of course, fully developed here. So, I mean, the delayed plan means that just what are you going to get out of this position? I mean, it's you got a little bit of a weakness to work with. Both sides have a bishop pair. The material is equal. There's just not much left here to play for. But Carlsen gives it a shot. He gets his knight to f5, and that turns out to be the first repetition. Then they just repeat. The rook goes back and forth. I guess neither side decided they could get anything, and that was a draw. But I do have other games in this position. I have Carlsen versus Anand, which went a little bit differently. We have bishop c5, so kind of the same thing. Carlsen took right away on c6, so he's going to play it a little bit differently, but now he's going to play like d3, queen d6, h3. So now this is more like a Ruy Lopez exchange variation. And I've played versions of this type of thing before as well, even with the knight on c3. Normally, when I play knight c3 in the Ruy Lopez exchange, look, some people were looking at this game earlier. Normally, when I play stuff like this in the Ruy Lopez exchange with the knight on c3, I try to get this move f6 in. I feel like that's maybe a little bit better. And then get them to play knight on gd7 to g6. It really feels like there's nothing here. Again, for white, that's just what we're going to run into in all these positions. It really feels like there's nothing here. But Carlsen was able to get something out of this position, which is, kind of impressive, to say the least. So let's look and see what Carlsen was able to get out of this position. So we have bishop e6 got played, and then we have bishop e3, knight to d7, bishop c5, knight c5, queen d2. So somewhere in the last couple moves, probably knight d7 was a very slight mistake. Bishop takes is going to be very slight edge white. Okay, so Carlsen managed to get the bishop pair fairly quickly. I wonder if there was some way that Anand could have avoided that. I guess the computer doesn't want to avoid it. It just wants to take on e3, and it thinks that's equal, but still probably very, very slight edge white in reality. So yeah, this is reasonable, I guess. So we got bishop e3, we got knight d7, takes, queen d2, d4 going after the middle, takes, and yeah, takes, castles queenside, takes, and then white has this very slight edge of having the 4-on-3 over here, and that's an isolated pawn, and that's a doubled pawn. So this is the type of advantage you could work and eventually turn into a win, which is apparently what Magnus Carlsen did this game. It looks like it was probably a very, very long game, just slowly working this advantage against Anand, trying to get his 4-on-3 going. Exchanges probably do favor. He's got the two really dangerous pawns now. F6, yeah, looking good, making progress. Yeah, just nice slow endgame progress here. Wow, a lot of stuff going on here. Took that pawn. Yeah, a lot of work. He gets there eventually, though. This is classic Carlsen chess. Just a slow endgame grind. Now the 3-on-2 on the other side of the board, totally equal. Oh my God! But he works this into a win, and he goes forever. Okay, but yeah, totally equal position all the way down to move 76. Gee whiz. Okay, so that's what you're getting. You're getting these completely equal positions that you can eventually work into a win. But I do have one more game here to take a look at. I've got actually just a lot of different games to take a look at. A lot, maybe some different analysis. We got Carlsen, yeah, Carlsen versus Anand. We just took a look at. We just took a look at that other game. Um, yeah, just let me see. We got one more game maybe. I got another. This is Carlsen versus Anand. We already looked at that one. So yeah, those are really the only two games that I've got here. I've got that Carlsen versus Karyana. I've got Carlsen versus Anand. I mean, okay. I mean, it's an interesting idea. It's a slow grind, is all it is. That's what I would say. I would say maybe the only other thing to look at would be something like Bishop E7. And I'd say this is all pretty much going to be the same. It's just going to be this very slow grind. You're going to have D6, and then I guess you could play A3 to retreat the bishop. The computer seems to like that. I don't want to run into knight D4 or knight A5 where they get my bishop pair where I can't take this pawn. So probably A3 very slow, bishop G4, H3. I guess bishop takes F3, queen A3, knight D4. No, they do get the bishop pair there. There must be another line, but Carlsen's playing this line. So maybe not. We have Carlsen versus Vincent Kamar is equal. Yeah, we got queen D1, knight B3. Just completely equality. Just C5. Yeah, there's nothing here. That's terrible. There must be some improvement here. I guess D3 is the only other option. Knight D5. Yeah, I don't like this. Maybe castles is a mistake. No, the computer likes castles. D6. This just looks totally equal to me. Yeah, this looks completely equalizing. And I mean, it's not like we don't have top games in this. It's not like we don't have people trying. Um, yeah, this line seems like a big problem. Because you have to do some slow moving plan no matter what, and you're gonna eventually want to shuffle this knight back and shuffle it out. You got to play H3. All these moves have to get in. I just don't know how I have enough time for all these moves. This bishop E7 line could be a big problem here, just because the idea that black has is just to play B5 and then D6. And then once he holds this pawn, then knight D4 and knight A5 to pick up the bishop pair are on, and if he gets that in, I don't see what we get out of the position. So that's something that you would need to really work out, find some kind of way to not lose that bishop pair. But if Carlsen isn't doing it, I don't know how we do it. So castles, b5, bishop b3, d6. Is there no move here? I mean, the computer says a3, and a3 is clearly insufficient. And that's what Carlsen played against Vincent Kamar. But a3 is clearly insufficient if they can just play bishop g4. Although the computer, I mean, it doesn't absolutely hate it. I mean, they have to lose the bishop pair to gain it. But c5, you're just not. I mean, d3, this just really feels like you're not getting anything. I guess you can play b4 and liquidate. I mean, what did Carlsen do? What did Carlsen do against Kamar? Maybe I can bring that up. So we got cb3, Kamar castled, and then we have d4 right away. Well, that's not. Yeah, of course he's getting something out of that. Even though he ended up getting a draw, he's getting something out of that. If they play c5, though, yeah, if they play c5, it's a totally different problem. c5, d3, and then castles. I guess queen f3, but like bishop e3, bishop g4. I mean, h6, queen g3, king h8, bishop e3, bishop d2, b4 maybe. b4's got to be the only idea. Takes. d5 is just totally equal though. They got to find d5 though. At least they got to find that. Takes. Complete equality. Yeah, you're not getting anything out of this. You might as well just shake hands now. Like even at my level, I mean, it's like yeah, king g8, and I mean, even if they just exchange queens next move, it's just nothing. You play bishop d2, they exchange, and you've got a weakness here and a weakness here. At least you're up a pawn. I don't know how you keep it. I mean, he plays rook e d8 here, and then he just takes, and then and then everybody goes home. I mean, if anybody's worse, maybe it's white. I mean, we got a weakness here, but he's got a weakness here. There's just nothing left. It's just nothing left to play for. It's just total equality. And you're gonna run into that. Like a lot of people are getting totally. At least though, maybe you can find something that somebody's unfamiliar with. I don't know if I'm gonna do like a full video on this where I put all the engines on it and go over it really, really deeply. The positions just look like horribly, horribly equal. But it is getting tried at the top levels. I mean, just keep in mind, like the idea behind openings like this is to just try to do something incredibly slow. Try to play something like d3, knight d2, knight g3, and then eventually play c3, bring this bishop back to c2, castles, and then play the Ruy Lopez kind of the slow way. Um, I'm stuck thinking that if you're going to try stuff like this, maybe d3 is a better approach. It seems like it's easier to get it all in. It seems like it's easier to play, this knight to d2 to f1 and then g3. I feel like maybe this is the better approach. Like even if we look at the Masters database, we'll see Carlsen trying this more, and we do. And it makes sense that he would try this more. There's more in it. You're not going to get prepped basically. And I think in the other line, I think you can get prepped. I think that bishop g4 knight d4 line is just preppy quality. And you don't want to run into that. So I'd say knight c3 is not so bad. Maybe d3 is a better way to do the same thing. Okay, well anyways, I hope you found this video helpful. I hope you learned something new about chess. Hope you can use some of these ideas in your own games. Thank you very much for watching.